The year was 1892, and Pine Hollow Ridge stood quiet beneath the Ozark sky, its mist rolling down the slopes like whispers of forgotten stories. Travelers rarely ventured there, not because of wild animals or bandits, but because of a house. Locals called it the Coffin House. It wasn't superstition, not entirely. The boards that formed its walls, floors, and roof were unmistakably cut from old coffins, dark wood streaked with faint carvings of names long buried, brass handles still attached to the panels, and when the wind blew just right, the entire place seemed to groan like the dead still inside it. But inside that house lived a family, the Dunsmores, and against all reason they called it home. Thomas Dunsmore wasn't a cruel man, just a broken one. A carpenter by trade, he had once made fine furniture for the wealthy families of St. Louis. But after a railway collapse took his wife Clara and two sons, his life unraveled. He moved south into the Ozarks, where no one knew him, bringing with him only his tools, his guilt, and a wagon of oak planks taken from the remains of an abandoned undertaker's workshop. To the townsfolk, it was madness to build a house from the very wood that once held corpses. To Thomas, it was penance. "If death took everything from me," he told the preacher once, "then let death hold me up." And so he built his home from coffins, one nail, one prayer, one ghost at a time. In the years that followed, Thomas remarried a quiet, kind widow named Martha Lyle, who had a daughter, Eliza, and a small boy, Henry. They were the only light in his dim world, and though the villagers whispered that no child should sleep under such cursed beams, the Dunsmores made the place alive again. Eliza would paint wildflowers on the coffin boards to cover the names carved into them. Henry would listen to the creaking walls at night, convinced the spirits were telling him bedtime stories. And Martha filled the kitchen with the smell of bread and honey, trying to drive away the scent of oak and sorrow. Despite everything, laughter returned, faint but real. But Pine Hollow Ridge had its secrets. Strange sounds carried from the forest at night, footsteps without bodies, crying without mouths. Eliza, now 14, began hearing whispers near the old house well. "Tell him the truth," the voices would say. "Tell him before it's too late." She thought it was the wind, until one night she saw a name carved deep into the floorboards beneath her bed. Clara Dunsmore. It wasn't new carving. It was old, weathered, and it seemed to glow faintly under the candlelight. Eliza couldn't sleep after that. She asked her mother, but Martha dismissed it. "Your stepfather doesn't speak of the past," she said gently, "and we respect that." But Thomas had grown quieter lately, staring at the walls as though they stared back. One night, Eliza lifted the loose plank under her bed. Beneath it, wrapped in a black cloth, was a locket. Inside, a faded picture of a woman with soft eyes and two boys smiling beside her, Clara and her sons. That was when Eliza realized something strange. The boards that formed her room weren't just coffin wood. They were from Thomas's own family's caskets. The following Sunday, a traveling preacher rode through Pine Hollow Ridge, warning of judgment and sin. When he reached the Dunsmore home, he refused to enter. He stood at the gate, hat in hand, and called out, "Brother Dunsmore, the Lord does not dwell among the dead." Thomas only replied, "Then perhaps he'll find me easier here." Later that night, as rain battered the windows, Thomas told Martha the truth, or part of it. "The undertaker owed me debt," he said. "He couldn't pay in coin, so he paid in wood." The coffins were never used, but Martha saw something in his eyes, the kind of sorrow that made lies necessary. Henry, now 8, had a curious habit. He liked to fall asleep with a small lantern by his bedside, claiming the coffin people didn't like the dark. Martha scolded him gently. "There are no coffin people, dear." But one night, she saw the lantern flicker and go out. Henry woke crying, pointing at the door. "She was here," he said. "The lady from the floor. She said she misses Papa." Martha tried to dismiss it as a dream, but she felt the chill too. And when she looked at Thomas that morning, he seemed pale, as though he already knew what Henry had seen. One misty evening, a stranger arrived, a young man with a limp and a letter in his hand. He introduced himself as Jonas Whitlock, a railway worker from St. Louis. "I knew a man named Thomas Dunsmore," he said softly. "He saved my life in the collapse of '83. Martha's eyes widened. "You were there?" Jonas nodded. "I was one of the men he pulled out, but I also know something about what happened after Thomas, standing in the doorway, went white as ash. He told Jonas to leave, but before he did, Jonas slipped Eliza a folded note and whispered, 'He didn't tell you the truth. Read this when you're ready.' That night, Eliza read the letter by lantern light. To whoever finds this, Thomas Dunsmore was not a victim of the collapse. He was one of its builders. The wood that broke was his work, his miscalculation. His wife and sons died because the bridge he designed failed. He carries that burden like a coffin on his back. He left St. Louis not to mourn, but to hide." Eliza's hands trembled. She understood now. The House of Coffins wasn't superstition. It was a confession carved into every wall. When she looked up, Thomas was standing in her doorway, tears streaming down his face. "You weren't meant to find that," he whispered. A storm swept the ridge that night, fierce and unrelenting. Lightning flashed across the coffin house, illuminating every name carved into the walls. The wind howled through the gaps, making the house moan like a chorus of the dead. Thomas gathered his family by the hearth. He confessed everything: how his pride led to the collapse, how guilt drove him into the mountains, how he used coffin wood to remind himself never to forget. "I thought I could build something strong enough to outlast my shame," he said. "But shame doesn't rot like wood. It grows." Martha held his hand. Eliza wept. Henry simply asked, "Papa, will the ghosts forgive you now?" Outside, thunder cracked, and then a sound, a splintering, groaning creak from beneath the floorboards, as if the house itself was breathing. The storm raged deep into the night. Thunder clawed across the sky, lightning flashed against the glass, and every beam of the coffin house shuddered as if in pain. Thomas stood in the center of the room, soaked in sweat and guilt, his hands pressed against the walls. "Hold together," he whispered to the boards. "Just a little longer." But then a low moan rose from beneath the floor. Not the creak of timber, but something almost human. Eliza screamed when the trapdoor to the cellar burst open, slamming against the wall. A cold gust rushed out, smelling of earth and old pine. Henry clung to Martha's skirt, and then, through the howl of the wind came a voice, soft, feminine, familiar. "Thomas." Thomas froze. That voice hadn't crossed his ears in 9 long years. He dropped to his knees and peered into the darkness below the trapdoor. "Clara?" he whispered. No answer, only the hiss of rain on the roof. Then, faintly, "Why did you bring us here?" Martha gasped. Eliza crossed herself. Thomas descended the cellar steps slowly, carrying the lantern. Below, the air was thick and damp. He traced his hand along the beams, coffin boards that he'd fitted himself. And then he saw it, carved deep into one plank, the names Clara, Samuel, and Daniel Dunsmore, his wife and sons. The carvings hadn't been there before, or perhaps he had simply never looked closely enough. He dropped the lantern, it hit the ground, and the light went out. When Thomas came back up, his face was pale and streaked with tears. He told his family to pack their things. "The house isn't safe," he said. "Not anymore." But before they could leave, the storm struck with full fury. A tree crashed through the roof, shattering the coffin beams and sending shards across the room. The house groaned like a dying creature. "Papa," Henry cried, "the house doesn't want us to go." Thomas lifted the boy into his arms. "The house wants peace, Henry." That's all. He carried his family out through the front door into the storm, lightning flashing behind them like a burning cross. But when Thomas looked back, he saw it, through the cracks of the broken roof, the faint flickering silhouettes of three figures standing in the window: Clara, Samuel, Daniel, and they were smiling. The storm broke by dawn. The Dunsmores took shelter in the barn of a nearby farmer, Elias Boone, who'd long avoided the family for fear of curses. Yet when he saw their faces, weary, drenched, terrified, his heart softened. "You're safe here," he told them. "That's what matters." By morning, the coffin house was nothing but smoke and splinters. It had collapsed in on itself, as if it had simply decided to lie down and rest. Thomas stared at the ashes from the ridge, his jaw trembling. Martha touched his arm. "You can build again, Thomas." "You're a good man." He shook his head. "I built too many things that shouldn't have been built." But Eliza said softly, "Maybe this time you build for the living." While searching through the wreckage later, Thomas found something strange. 3 intact coffins, buried beneath the ruins, perfectly preserved. The names carved on them matched the ones from his cellar, but they weren't empty. Inside each was nothing but tools: saws, hammers, nails, chisels, the same tools he had used to build the house. Martha realized the truth before he did. "You didn't bury your family, Thomas," she whispered. "You buried your craft. Your hands." Tears welled in his eyes. "I thought if I laid my tools to rest, maybe their souls would rest too." But the lesson was clearer now. The tools weren't cursed. It was what he'd done with them that haunted him. Weeks passed. The Dunsmores began rebuilding a small cottage farther down the ridge, with fresh timber, bright pine, no dark history. One afternoon, Jonas Whitlock returned. He brought supplies, nails, and a stack of good oak. "I heard what happened," he said. "Thought you could use a friend." Thomas stared at him a long moment before replying. "I lied to everyone," he said, "including myself." Jonas nodded. "We all lie when the truth hurts too much, but the truth's still the only thing that'll set you straight." Together the two men rebuilt the new home. Every strike of the hammer sounded less like guilt and more like forgiveness. The Dunsmores' new cottage was smaller, simpler, no ornate trim, no heavy oak. And yet, on certain nights when the wind swept through the valley, Eliza would swear she could still hear the faintest whisper from the ridge, not the sorrowful groans of the coffin house, but a gentler sound, like a lullaby. Sometimes Henry would look out the window and say, "Mama, they're up there, the people from the old house." "They're happy now." Martha would nod, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart." They are spring came. Thomas began fixing the townsfolk's furniture again, quietly, humbly. People who once whispered "coffin builder" now called him the craftsman on the ridge. He refused payment from widows and orphans, saying only, "I've owed more than money could ever repay." One day, a poor family brought him a broken cradle. Thomas repaired it beautifully, carving into its base a small inscription: "From hands that once built for the dead, may this hold only life." The cradle became known in the county as the carpenter's gift, passed from family to family whenever a new child was born. Years later, after Thomas passed peacefully in his sleep, Eliza, now grown, found a sealed envelope tucked inside his old tool chest. It was addressed simply, "To my family." Inside, in Thomas's careful script, were these words: "If you're reading this, I've gone to meet the ones I lost. I built a house from coffins to keep them close, but what I learned is this: the dead don't need our sorrow. They need our peace. I thought I was building a tomb, but in truth, I built my way back to love. Remember this: every nail you drive into the world, drive it with kindness. That's how you keep a house standing, even after you're gone." Eliza wept over the letter until the ink blurred. Then she hung her father's hammer over the door where it would never rust. Years later, travelers passing through Pine Hollow Ridge would stop to admire the small white cottage that stood amid fields of wildflowers. They'd hear stories of the man who once built a house from coffins, and how, in the end, he built something far greater. No one dared go near the old ridge at first. But one spring, when Eliza climbed up with her children, she found something miraculous. Where the coffin house had once stood, hundreds of white lilies had bloomed, pure, silent, and fragrant. Their roots had wound through the charred remains of the coffin boards, drinking from what was once grief, turning it into beauty. Eliza knelt, whispering to the wind, "Papa, I see it now. You didn't build with death. You built toward forgiveness." And as the wind stirred the lilies, it almost sounded like the faintest reply, "Home at last."